welcome everybody and good afternoon. I'm really excited that you are joining us for this conversation. This is Space for Trust, the ACE Act and Trust in Philanthropy, being hosted by Independent Sector. My name is Regina Bell and I serve as Director of Government Relations and Public Policy at the Council of Michigan Foundations. I'm also a member of Independent Sector's Public Policy Committee. So before we actually get started, I want to respectfully acknowledge that Independent Sector is based in Washington, D.C., the ancestral home of the Nacotchtank and Anacostan and Piscataway people who are still in the area and are working to reclaim their land and traditional practices. I also want to acknowledge that many of the buildings and places that we inhabit in Washington were built with the labor of enslaved people. As we begin, we also want to hold a moment of silence for the more than 7,000 people who have lost their lives to COVID-19 in the US, and the countless others who have suffered at the hands of injustice in our communities. This convening is the first in a series of engagements that Independent Sector is offering around data to inform policy and practice reforms. And here we're going to be doing a deep dive into trust in the sector and what might be fueling some of the trends that we're seeing, and also possible ways to address levels of public trust in philanthropy in particular. Again, this is the first part of a series of convenings that Independent Sector is hosting. And so what I'd like to be able to do is, before we kind of get into the conversation with our panelists, and I'm really excited to have this such a prestigious group that Independent Sector has put together, we really want to understand who's actually in the room with us. So I'd like to be able to have the team participate in an anonymous interactive poll. So if you don't mind executing the poll and actually responding to the question, and again, it's an opportunity for us to be able to really understand who's in the room with us. So it looks like we have a majority of those that are representing public charities that are in the room, and the next largest group are funders, and then others. So I'm really going to be curious around who's the making up the other group. So again, that just allows us to really understand who we're having this conversation with. And so we're going to be hearing from our speakers as they define the potential problem of trust in philanthropy and also discuss possible solutions based on what we've heard. So we've actually broken up the conversation into two parts. So really defining the problem and then allowing for discussion around potential solutions. Then we're going to be able to make sure that we hear your thoughts around a pathway forward. What I also want to do is just make sure that we cover some of the logistics. Please feel free to pose questions that you might have throughout the discussion utilizing the chat box. We will be monitoring that and making sure that we're incorporating the questions that you have throughout the webinar. Please also make sure to keep your microphones muted. Although I do think that as of right now, behind the scenes, we're muting mics for folks, but just make sure that if you do unmute yourself, that you do then in turn mute yourself once you're finished. And then finally, I want to let participants know that this event is being recorded and will be posted to Independent Sector's website. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn things over to our panelists who are going to kind of get things started and introduce themselves. So I'm going to ask Les to kick things off and then turn to John and Victor. So Les?
Good afternoon. I'm Les Lenkowsky, and I'm a professor emeritus of philanthropic studies and public policy at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and also a regular contributor to the Chronicle of Philanthropy.
And last, this is John Pratt. I'm former executive director of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, recently stepped down after 35 years. MCN is an association of 2,300 nonprofits in the state of Minnesota, which it's an association, so we lobby, we conduct research, educational activities, and cost-saving discounts. And I'm stepping into a role as a senior research fellow, including issues like how does public policy affect charitable giving?
Hi there, my name is Victor Tolomeo. I'm a research director at Edelman Data and Intelligence. We are a public opinion research and market research consultancy. And my background is primarily in public policy research and issue advocacy. And I had the privilege to work with Independent Sector for 2 years now as the research lead with this study of public trust in philanthropy and also in nonprofits.
That's perfect. So thank you so much to the three of you for joining this conversation. And I want to maximize our time. So Victor, I'm going to just turn things over to you to run through some of the critical data that Edelman has kind of put together as we think about trust and philanthropy and nonprofits.
Absolutely. So can you all confirm that you can see my screen? Okay, great. Had some issues on the 1 p.m. So I'm going to give a brief overview of sort of the main points, the top line takeaways from this research that we've done in conjunction with IS over the last 2 years. But before I do that, just a couple of quick notes about the methodology. We fielded 2 online surveys among the American adult population, so that's Americans over the age of 18. And we wanted to make sure that these studies were representative of the American population across all of the demographic factors that a opinion pollster would traditionally weight their survey on. So this is a representative study across race, income, educational attainment, gender, age, region, and urbanicity. It is, to our knowledge, the largest sample size opinion survey of trust and philanthropy that has ever been conducted. And we conducted the 2021 wave of this study in the first half of May of this year. So to jump right into it, we measure trust on a scale from 1 to 9, where 9 means trust a great deal and 1 means I don't trust at all. And we measured it for both nonprofits and philanthropy. We aggregate these trust numbers up into a net trust score, which is simply the percent reporting high trust. That would be 7 to 9 on the 9-point scale, minus low trust, that's 1 through 4 on the 9-point scale. And so as you can see, between 2020 and this year, trust in philanthropy significantly declined from a net trust score of 15 last year to 4 this year. And this is because, as you can see in the rightmost blue column, the percent reporting high trust in philanthropy declined by 6 points, and the percent reporting low trust in the sector increased by 5 points. We also looked at trust across 3 subsectors of philanthropy. So corporate philanthropy, private foundations, and high net worth individual giving. And we saw significant drops in trust across all 3 of these. We asked a few open-ended questions in our survey to get at the reasons for why Americans might trust or distrust philanthropy. And what we saw was that these reasons are very similar to what people report for why they trust or don't trust nonprofits. For those who trust philanthropy, they say that they believe these organizations, their mission is to serve the greater good, to offer help to others. They do it for altruistic reasons. For those who have low trust in philanthropy, they say things like they believe that the money doesn't go where it should. There might be too much money going to overhead or salaries, that people running these organizations might not be in it for the right reasons. They may have also heard about scandals or corruption, or also instances of political bias. We looked at the data in our survey, and we wanted to create kind of a profile of who was more likely to trust and who was more likely to distrust philanthropy. And again, the profile of trusters and distrusters for philanthropy is very similar to that for nonprofits. Those who have high trust in philanthropy are much more likely to be to have a college degree or a postgraduate degree. They're more likely to have higher incomes. They're more likely to be politically on the left of the spectrum, to live in urban areas, and to be a little bit older than average. The profile of distrusters is kind of the mirror opposite. We see that those who distrust philanthropy are more likely than average to have less formal education, have lower levels of household income, live in a rural area, more likely to be on the right of the political spectrum, and be a little bit younger. And then finally, I think the other key takeaway is that I think the primary factor leading to trust or distrust is familiarity with philanthropy. For respondents who reported being familiar with any of the 3 subsectors, their trust scores were just significantly higher than the trust scores for those who were not familiar with philanthropy in general, and also it holds for each of the 3 subsectors. And this is something that we also saw in the nonprofit study that we conducted, that trust seems to be local, that nonprofit organizations that are active on the local level in local communities have much higher trust than organizations that are national or global. People seem to trust what is most proximate to them, what they have the most interactions with, what they're most familiar with. And since philanthropy itself is much less well known, and there's much less interaction between the average American and philanthropy, we think that's one of the reasons why trust in philanthropy is significantly lower than that of nonprofits, and also why it's declining. So I think I'll pause there. I know we wanted to get into some discussion, but there's plenty more data, and we'll be able to talk about it if anyone has questions, but I think I'll leave it at there.
Thank you, Victor. Really appreciate that. And so what I kind of took away from that is institutional trust is declining, that trust disparities kind of deepen and align with broader social trends that we're seeing. Also, that public confidence in the sector as a force for good, that kind of remains to be true. And then civic action and trust kind of reinforce one another with greater trust dependent upon the proximity to the work that's actually occurring in community. Is that kind of fair to state in terms of the key findings from the data?
I think that's fair. Yes, we have a significant amount of data. If anybody's interested in any of those points, I'm happy to go over it in detail. But I think that's true. I think some of the other research that we've conducted at Edelman this year shows that institutional trust across all the major institutions in American life, government, media, business, NGOs, has been declining. It's been declining since about the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. There are various reasons for that. And I think philanthropy is definitely not immune from those broader trends. The other thing I would say is that, as you mentioned, yes, there is a little bit of a silver lining. We did see a data point in our study that even though trust in philanthropy is low and it seems to be declining, still about 65% of Americans say that they are confident that philanthropy can play a role in strengthening society today. So all is not lost. And I think that's a good summary of the key takeaways, Regina.
So John, I maybe want to turn to you. Why do you think that there's kind of this decline in trust in philanthropy and the nonprofit kind of sector overall? What do you think is attributing to that?
Unmuted. Yeah, it's a great question, and certainly something we should be concerned with. This reminds me a little bit of the question nonprofits often, sort of perceive that money has never been tighter. But then when we do research, we find actually nonprofits' total economic activity is going up. This question of, well, what does the public think of nonprofits and should we be worried about it is something my organization has cared a lot about, actually in several respects, including public support of tax exemptions or favorable tax treatment. So we started doing public opinion polling about that subject 30 years ago. And so if we could pull up sort of slide number 1 that looks at, if we ask the public, what do you think of nonprofits? Is it worth it? Should they be exempt from paying taxes? And so we started asking this question using the exact same language every year, 9 times in the last 30 years, and asking, do you agree or disagree that nonprofit organizations should continue to be free from paying taxes? Well, this is kind of a proxy question of, do you feel like the deal is worth it? Are these organizations, are they actually using the money the way they say they would use it? Are they trustworthy? Does it actually benefit the public? And we've seen sort of small variations, and often the variation is within the margin of error. Looks like, perhaps a dent in the last 10 years, but overall, generally between 80 and 90% of respondents to, and this was a, sort of a broad survey of 600 people in the state, half from the Twin Cities, half from greater Minnesota, and found overall sort of not much change in the last 30 years in terms of willingness to have these organizations be active. I should say also 76% of Minnesotans report that they make contributions to nonprofits. So I think we should be concerned about these issues. I'm not sure I see that big of a dent in public trust.
Thanks for sharing that. And I know that there's some questions that are coming into from the participants as well, and I want to be able to get to those. But first, I'd like to be able to perhaps Les turn to you, because I want to make sure that your voice is entered into this conversation. And one of the things when I think about the data is really around people's understanding and even familiarity as we think about philanthropy, what philanthropy does, how it operates, and even the definition of trust. And so I'm wondering if you might be able to just kind of speak to that a little bit, in terms of, you know, how we should be interpreting this data and what concerns we should be having, particularly in light of just kind of the understanding of philanthropy, who we are, what we do, and how philanthropy operates.
Yeah, I essentially agree with John that this is interesting data, but not particularly surprising, and it's not something to be worrying a lot about. We could trace distrust of philanthropy way back into Greek mythology, even. Oscar Wilde in the 19th century once referred to philanthropy as the refuge of people who wish to annoy their fellow citizens. One of the great historians of American philanthropy, Robert Bremner, observed that we expect people who are wealthy to be generous with their money, but we also expect to criticize them when they are. So I think this is a recurring theme. There have been a couple of things underway, one of which has been mentioned already, the decline in trust of all institutions in our society. But another, in the 1930s, Arthur Schlesinger Sr. referred to Americans as a nation of joiners. It was 30 years ago now that Robert Putnam talked about how Americans were bowling alone. We've become less likely to join organizations. We have data suggesting that a smaller share of the population now gives money to charity as well. So in their individual experiences, people are more distant than they used to be from the work of philanthropy in the nonprofit sector. And as the data we've just looked at shows, familiarity does help build confidence and trust. There are two things, though, I would point out that we ought to keep in mind as we look at this data. First of all, a lot of the worry concerns something called net trust. That is the difference between the share of the population that express high trust in philanthropy is about 30%, and the share that express low trust, I think that was 26%, meaning a net trust score of 4%. Well, not clear to me what this means. This is a bit like saying only 5% of the American public voted for wanted to see Joe Biden as president of the United States. Of course, that was his margin of victory over Donald Trump. And I don't think even Donald Trump believes that only 5% of Americans supported Joe Biden. So net trust is rather problematic. The important thing to note in these data is what's not in them. Namely, what's not reported are the folks in the middle. In all the categories in this data, there are more people, larger percentage people who are neither high trust nor low trust than there are at the extremes. In other words, the average American is neutral, you might say. Neither has a high level of confidence nor a low level of confidence in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. And by and large, that's pretty much what I expect. The other thing we should always be aware of, keep in mind, is that trust is not the only thing that nonprofits and philanthropy seek to develop. Often nonprofits and philanthropy do things, advocacy being a particular example, that may cause a lot of mistrust or criticism or disagreement. And we regard those activities as valuable too. So while a certain level of trust is important for philanthropy and the nonprofit sector, it's not the be all and end all of what the sectors do. And there's nothing in the data we've been looking at to suggest it is more problematic today than it's ever been.
Thanks, Les. And it really, particularly your point around thinking about some of the things that may kind of cause conflict, particularly or disagreement, particularly in the advocacy space, makes me think about some of the work around social justice that is actually occurring, that philanthropy is funding and nonprofits are engaging in. And so I do want to go back to Connor's question, and I know, Victor, you answered it, but I also just want to make sure that we're kind of following what's happening in the chat and bringing it into overall conversation. So Connor's question was, how does someone's race correlate with their trust of nonprofits and philanthropy? And Victor, do you want to maybe articulate what you shared in the chat?
Absolutely. And I actually have a slide to kind of display this. So as I mentioned in the chat, essentially the findings from this study is that trust in philanthropy is largely consistent across the major ethnic divisions in our society. So in this year, 2021, the net trust score for whites was 3, for Black Americans it was 7, Hispanics 5, for Asian Americans it was a little bit higher, it was 13. But I think the important thing to take away from this is the declines across all of these groups. And if I could respond a little bit to what Les said about this idea of a net trust score, the reason we calculate these scores is simply for convenience. It's to have one number to kind of summarize where trust is. Because you're right, actually there are a lot of people in the middle, the 5 or 6 on a 9-point scale, the neutrals. But I think if you look at this data, there are declines across the board in the percent reporting high trust, and there are increases both in the percent that are neutral and the percent that are reporting low trust across the board for all these ethnic groups. So I think this is clearly a sign that trust in philanthropy is declining. And there are more people in the neutral middle box, but I think it's an interesting question. Why are people shifting from high trust into neutral if they're not shifting from high trust into low trust?
Yeah, so I want to make sure that we could spend, I think, the entire hour going through the data and dissecting it. And I want to now maybe pivot a little bit to kind of talking about some of the solutions. So, you know, I know that there's kind of maybe some issues about the premise around trust, like and where we are. But I do want to, if we agree that there is a concern around trust, what might be some of the solutions that we might pose to help deal with the trust factor, both as we think about public charities as well as philanthropy? And so, Victor, maybe if you could share some of the strategic drivers that might work to increase trust?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so we tested a very large list of drivers. So these are characteristics of philanthropic organizations or actions they might take. And we did a statistical analysis to determine which of these were correlated and led to increased trust in a given foundation or philanthropic organization. And so the top 5, and these are ranked by their contribution to trust in a given organization, are endorsements from public figures, partnerships with government, partnerships with business, expressing and having clear values for the organization, and then finally engaging underserved communities. I know the first one, endorsements from public figures, might be a little bit surprising, but I think when you think about the finding that familiarity is so correlated with trust, and that philanthropy itself is not all that well known in the general public, I think my hypothesis, at least, is that the reason endorsements from public figures and also partnerships would rise to the top in terms of the levers an organization could use to boost trust is because all of these things sort of say you have a fairly trusted public figure who is familiar in the community, that person might gift some of that familiarity, some of that credibility and trust to the philanthropic organization that's less well known. And I think the same thing is probably at play for partnerships with government and partnerships with business.
So I was just trying to type in the chat because I also want to make sure that we turn to the audience about some of the response to some of the drivers that Victor has also shared, and then making sure that we're getting insights from you around, if you agree with this premise, what are some of the ways that we might consider as a collective sector to really boost trust? What are some of those critical things that we could be doing to do so? And so while you're considering kind of a response to that question, I also want to turn to Les and pose that same question.
Thanks. As some of you may know, I was privileged to serve as CEO of the Corporation for National Community Service in the Bush 43 administration. And I used to, in my speeches, always ask the question, if you were in a hospital and in the recovery room coming out of a serious operation, would you prefer to see at your bedside a trained nurse or a volunteer, what we used to call candy stripers? We have for many years now been professionalizing the nonprofit sector. Many of you, if not everyone, sitting in on this are professionals of one sort or another in the nonprofit sector, and that's very good. A professionalized nonprofit sector, we expect, is a more effective one. But we also lose something in that process. We make it much more difficult for organizations that are reliant on professionals to find ways to incorporate volunteers in their work. So in direct response to your question, Regina, what I used to urge my audiences when I was CEO, and what I would still say, is one of the responsibilities of being a professional in the nonprofit sector is to look for and implement ways to engage more volunteers.
And John, I might pose the same question to you.
Well, I actually think about the flip side is how do we decrease trust? And we've seen some examples of, it was 30 years ago, United Way of America, their worldwide CEO was convicted of essentially embezzlement and stealing from the organization, and contributions to United Ways took a huge nosedive. In Minnesota, we had a case, Sister Kenny scandal, where a polio serving organization hired a former mayor of Minneapolis who illegally doubled his salary, was engaged in sort of theft from the organization, and then contributions not only to that organization, but all similar organizations serving the disability community took a nosedive. So I think, having sort of credible enforcement and having belief that someone is watching and is helping make sure that the money is used properly is a part of maintaining trust. And I think we saw that also with the Wounded Warrior situation, sort of contributions, people voting with their contributions or withdrawing them. So being careful to have a credible sort of enforcement system of the IRS and attorneys general is essential to sort of shoring up that trust that, yes, these organizations are actually doing what they should be doing. And it's worth pointing out, most countries in the world don't have the kind of active charitable contributions that the US and actually sort of similar countries, UK and Australia have. and it is that long time trust that's been built up.
Yeah, so I think the idea that there is a place for kind of credible enforcement, you know, of organizations and ensuring that they're doing what they say that they're doing, and particularly the examples that you highlighted, I think all would agree that enforcement, you know, against kind of corrupt behavior is really critical. I am wondering, though, in the absence of those types of kind of extreme circumstances. And really, when we think about some of the provisions that are included in the ACE Act, do you all, and I'm opening up this question, I think, to everyone, do you all believe that that helps to address this issue of trust?
Well, I would simply say that the ACE Act, whatever one may think of the merits of it, really addresses a very tiny portion of the philanthropic world, both mostly donor advised funds. So it's not clear to me that it will have any effect if it's enacted on trust generally in philanthropy or the nonprofit sector.
You know, I think one of the biggest changes for nonprofits and charitable giving and sort of people's experience with nonprofits is coming out of the, was it the 2017 Tax Act, which sort of dramatically changed how many people get to deduct their charitable contributions from their income tax calculation. And certainly we've sort of promoted the idea that this is, people don't give because they get a deduction, but the amount can be influenced. But some of the polling showing a decreasing percentage of people actively contributing, and we know that now less than half of the people get to take a deduction, is that sort of taking more people out of the game and making them wonder, you know, it would be a serious harm if the public began to feel that nonprofit and charitable activity was really the playground of the rich and not for everyone.
Yeah, so John, your point really makes me think about the importance of the Universal Giving Pandemic Response Act, and the advancements to really work to make sure that some of the provisions that were included in the CARES Act and then the end of the year deal are actually made more long-term and actually expansive to allow for more Americans, and particularly, you know, thinking about those that don't itemize, to be able to take advantage of some of the tax benefits. And it also makes me think about the face of philanthropists. So when we think about the face of philanthropy, we often think about those high net worth individuals. But when I think about the work, and particularly here at the Council of Michigan Foundations and donor advised funds that are set up at community foundations, and certainly through some of the commercial vehicles as well, they're not always high net worth individuals. They're everyday folks that have decided that this is the way in which they want to contribute. And so I'm just curious a little bit, Les, if you could maybe kind of speak to the face of a donor, the face of philanthropy.
Yeah, I would say that while a smaller percentage of the population gives, our estimates vary a great deal. There is no single measure accounting for how much, who gives and how much. I'd also point out that there has, for most people, except maybe lawyers and accountants, there is no tax deduction for volunteering. Never has been. And yet about 1 of 4 adult Americans, measured by the Census Bureau, report themselves volunteering on average over 50 hours a year for one or another kind of charity, and a lot more probably do so informally. So I agree, the face of philanthropy is a very broad face in the United States. The great achievement of Americans is to democratize both giving and volunteering. We don't find that in most other countries. And it still remains healthy, even if we can't always measure it very well. On the other hand, the lifestyles of rich and famous givers are always more newsworthy than the lifestyles of those of us who go about helping one or another cause. Here in Bloomington, Indiana, where I am, we're not far from a camp that is housing about 5,000 Afghan refugees families right now. And there is an outpouring of money and volunteering and goods, donation of goods to help them. I have no idea what the magnitude is, but that is an example of American philanthropy at its best, and it will get very little coverage in newspapers or on television.
It's a great point, and we're certainly seeing that here in Michigan as well. So Micah, or Emily, I don't know if we have the ability, because I feel like I don't want to be the only one posing some of the questions, and I want to make sure that participants are able to do so. So do we have the ability for folks to be taken off of mute? And I want to maybe go to Jeff and then to Mark to pose their questions.
Yeah, Regina, anyone in the meeting now can unmute themselves.
Perfect. So Jeff, if you want to kick things off.
Sure. Thanks, Regina, and thanks for leading us today. So obviously, one of the hooks into this conversation, the context, is the ACE Act. And while it is unclear, at least to us, as to what the prognosis for that legislation looks like, the question that I have to this group and to the speakers is, when we are thinking, if we are thinking, the policymaking community is thinking about philanthropy reform in future, to what extent should increasing trust in philanthropy, however we assess that, actually be one of the key criteria by which we determine, is this policy to support? Does it go far enough? Is it effective? How do we assess that?
If I could just sort of respond, I guess a lot will depend on the policy. There have been instances where increasing trust in philanthropy has played a role in policy making. In 1969, for example, in the 69 Tax Act, one of the reasons foundations were prohibited from giving grants to individuals, they can only give them to 501c3 organizations, is because some members of Congress were upset that the Ford Foundation had given support to a couple of aides of the late Senator Robert F. Kennedy. In a sense, that is an effort to restore trust in philanthropy, but I think we could also see it as pure politics as normal, in the sense that obviously some members of Congress didn't much care for Senator Kennedy. So I think we have to be very careful, in other words, Jeff, in using trust, building trust in philanthropy as a standard against which we can measure changes in public policies. Some will help, others will invite abuses.
Thanks, Les.
Regina, you're referring to the 69 Tax Act, which was kind of sort of the big rewriting of charitable law and creating sort of public charities and private foundations that people have now gotten very used to. I think in a lot of the principle of that legislation, there were sort of regulations and restrictions, but much of it was around reporting and transparency. And two of the, well, there was sort of the payout requirement, which was a big departure. And part of the concern was, were the foundations actively being used, or were they sort of just warehouses? And so requiring 5% payout. Another key principle was requiring disclosure of the names of organizations and the uses of funds. The growth of DAFs has now sort of created sort of more questions around the transparency side. And I would like to share sort of slide number 2, which is one part of the ACE Act. And I think the ACE Act has gotten a lot of attention around the changes in payout and sort of setting up different types of DAFs based on their payout. But this transparency requirement addresses sort of two of those key elements of the '69 Tax Act, which was this requirement of reporting where are the funds going. And why is this important? Well, the IRS and the attorneys general are responsible for overseeing these charitable funds to make sure they're used properly for their charitable purposes. So this requirement would say that private foundations will report the amount of their contributions going to DAFs and what donation advice, basically what the uses of funds were out of those DAFs. And why is this important? Well, $3 billion was transferred from over 2,200 private foundations between 2010 and 2018 going into DAFs. At that point, attorneys general can no longer see how the funds are being used. Each of these private foundations are charitable trusts, and under trust law, it's important for the trustees to report to beneficiaries about the use of funds so that they can enforce their rights and understand how it's being used. Since many of the private foundations have restrictions, maybe their funds can only be used in the state of Michigan, or they can only be used for scholarships, it's impossible for either the public or attorneys general to know that. So under trust law, attorneys general could request that information from each private foundation. A key part of the '69 Tax Act also requires every private foundation to share its annual return with the attorney general of the state it's located in. So rather than have sort of tens of thousands of requests of information submitted separately by attorneys general to private foundations about their use of DAF funds, this should be required as part of the regular 990 PF. So I would point this out as sort of a natural extension of the '69 Tax Act, and really the ACE legislation, and is getting lots of interesting discussion, but as proposed is probably the '69 Tax Act Part 2, trying to bring it back into same kind of transparency requirements as originally intended. So no one intended DAFs to be used as a workaround around transparency requirements. And I think this would be a sort of common sense extension of the '69 Tax Act.
So I know that we actually have a limited amount of time and a couple of more questions, as well as a few polls that we want to be able to execute. And so I want to get to maybe one or two of the questions. And I'd like for us to make sure that as we're thinking about this and keeping responses pretty succinct. John, your comments really made me think about some of the ruling that recently came down from the Supreme Court, and also the NAACP case as well. Steve posed a question around, does the ability to deduct fair market value of appreciated assets rather than cash or cost basis add to the dilemma here that the deduction will soon be only for the wealthy? So Steve, I don't know if you wanted to add more quickly and then allow for some discussion.
No, this is an issue not only for contributions to donor advised funds, but contributions to any charity. The ability of an individual to deduct fair market value as opposed to their basis, I think just adds to the potential of the charitable deduction being just for the wealthy, if you will. I'm just interested if the panel has any thoughts on that.
Well, let's be careful about calling people wealthy. As I understand it, there are still going to be about 10% of all tax-paying households who are itemizing deductions. 90% will not be. Now that maybe they're more recent figures, but those are the ones that are in my mind. 10% of tax-paying households basically will include a household with, say, 2 teachers in it, or 2 lawyers. In other words, 2 professionals. Now, we might regard them as wealthy. Certainly in the top 10% is one way of regarding them as wealthy, but to many people, they would not be seen as wealthy.
I want to make sure that we can get to Mark's question. I'm sorry, Steve, if your comment is really quick.
By the way, I'm not advocating this. I'm just saying that the potential, concern as people look at the deduction in general.
Mark talked a little bit about the extent to which trust is about educating the public about what nonprofits and foundations are, and about building a strong brand for themselves. So I'm wondering, Les and John, and perhaps even others, and Victor, if you maybe could just kind of share some thoughts regarding that quickly.
Sure, I can go first. Something we saw in the nonprofit study we conducted was that trust seems to be very correlated, not just with familiarity, but also with interactions with an organization. So Americans who reported that they received services from a nonprofit, or that they volunteered, or had some sort of interaction, had much, much higher trust scores than those who had no interaction whatsoever. So I'm not sure if it's an issue just of educating people, but I think it definitely is. Trust is definitely an issue of interaction between the organization and individuals in the community.
In the longer version, correct me if I'm wrong, Victor, of the Edelman study, I think one of the drivers of distrust you noted in philanthropy was the perception that tax benefits were being taken, but the money was not really being used for charitable purposes, if I remember that correctly. And I think that is true, but the obvious solution is let's end tax deduction for all contributions.
Heaven forbid, Les.
What's wrong with that? We're concerned about the wealthy taking unfair advantage. We're concerned about people being critical of people getting away with it by taking tax deductions. Let's end tax deductions.
Well, Les, John, and Victor, that is some note to kind of end on. And I think we want to certainly take a moment to thank you for your participation in this conversation. I just want to extend sincere appreciation to our panelists, Victor, John, and Les, and certainly an appreciation to Independent Sector for hosting this event. Make sure that you sign up for one of the future events where we'll be unpacking various components of the ACE Act in context of both equity and other important issues. So thank you all again for participating, and enjoy the remainder of your afternoon.